This is Motorsport. Join the conversation. Contact the show on Twitter, on Facebook, and on our website, Motorsport Radio.
Hello and welcome back, guys, to Motorsport Talks. We are now going to discuss one of the blue ribbon events of the year. It is, of course, the British GT Championship, a championship which features high horsepower, high speed and close racing around some of Britain's best tracks. And joining me to talk about this is, of course, Andy Lloyd, only editor of Endurance and GT, and of course Mike Seaborn, who does drive a Jag, and occasionally it works for the whole race, as we found out in opener at Silverstone.
Occasionally, yeah.
So I'll go to you, Andy, first. British GT, obviously, there's been some pretty big switches, especially between GT4 and GT3 over the course of the winter. Why don't you talk our viewers through some of the switches and the ones that especially have caught your eye?
Well, good evening, everybody. Yeah, I mean, we're off for the opening round of the British GT Championship for 2022. We're going back to Alton Park for the opening round, where we haven't been for a couple of years due to all the issues. It's an absolutely packed grid across both GT3 and GT4. I think this year we've got something like 18 GT3 cars on the grid, which is the biggest GT3 grid since 2014, and 13 cars on the GT4 grid. And I think, if memory serves, I think that's the biggest ratio of GT3 to GT4 cars we've seen for some time. And it's interesting in as much as it wasn't that long ago, 3 or 4 years ago, people were saying that GT3 was dead in the UK, that it was effectively going to be one massive great GT4 grid, sort of the UK equivalent of GT4 European Series. And yet here we are with an absolutely bumper grid, with people moving up from GT4 into GT3. And I think when you look at the GT3 grid, I think that the most interesting thing is who is going to be fighting for the championship this year, because we've got some very experienced peddlers. We've got some very big names racing in British GT this year. And we've got some very interesting entries as well coming into the GT3 grid. So yeah, I think it's going to be an absolutely fantastic season.
I mean, Andy, we've seen when British GT races at Alton Park, the pit lane causes a massive issue. With the size of the grid we've got this year, do you foresee some major sort of teams getting held up, sort of almost like massive delays going in the pit lanes this year?
Well, they stagger the grid, they stagger the pit windows for GT3 and GT4. But I certainly think that, and we saw this at Brands, I think back in 2016, when all the GT3 grid pitted on pretty much the same lap, and I think it was Rick Parfitt Jr. that was balked in the pit lane, couldn't get out. He was very vociferous in his unhappiness at the end of the race that it obviously cost him time. It's going to be the opening round. There's going to be a lot of, it's the opening round. People haven't had a lot of track time so far, or many people haven't had a lot of track time this year. Some of the drivers definitely have. There's going to be a lot of sense of we need to get some points on the board early doors in the first round. So yeah, it's a tight pit lane. There could well be some squabbles.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, you've driven Alton Park, obviously. What would be the challenges these drivers will be facing on the lap of Alton Park on what looks to be a very warm, sunny Easter weekend, really?
Yeah, well, the heat's going to be a bit tricky because there's not much of a chance to give the tyres any relent around Alton. I think if you try and back off around Alton to save tyres, you'll lose an inordinate amount of time. That's just the nature of the circuit. big braking zones is the impression I get from Alton, or not so much the big braking zones, but the bumpy ones. There's a couple of braking zones at Alton that if the car's not perfectly happy underneath you, which is obviously a challenge over a fairly long race, the braking zones at Alton can be really tricky.
Yeah, I mean, you've got the big one, of course, will be you've got Deer Leap as well, which is that iconic coming across the pit lane, start finish line, where they come over this rise, and you can see the cars almost take off as they go over this rise. But I mean, Andy, you know, they're using the island hairpin circuit, I'm guessing, the full circuit.
Yeah.
But that obviously doesn't bring in much overtaking with that chicane. Where are the main overtaking opportunities on the Alton Park circuit?
I guess going into the start-finish straight, that always seems to be and going down into turn one, that always seems to be a favourite one. I mean, typically at Alton Park, you do see some very fast and furious racing. You see a lot of drivers try to take some grass to get around on the outside. But it is a tight circuit. It's a fast circuit as well. So I think it's going to be a real challenge, especially with some of the drivers, as you say, moving up into the GT3 grid and some new teams in GT3 and in GT4. They're going to be getting a feel for their cars. Don't forget, a number of these teams have already tested. I think there's been 4 or 5 test days so far up at Alton Park, and I've seen images of cars out there. So I think a number of the drivers are going to be getting some good experience, but it's not the same as racing, and it's certainly not the same as racing on hopefully a hot bank holiday Monday, as hopefully we're going to see next week.
Yeah, what's the strange thing about it is the fact that they are racing on the Saturday, and then they're racing on the Monday, because on the Sunday there's like a charity racing event. They've got the Alton Park Charity Day, so that's sort of kind of weird, isn't it? Really, where you'll have all the qualifying take place on Saturday, but then you've got a 2-day break before the racing happens. I
believe it's out of respect for the fact that it's Easter Sunday and local churches. It's typically been the way that British GT, when they're running this weekend, over the Easter weekend, have done it. But of course, it does give teams a chance to kind of reset after qualifying on the Saturday, really think about what they're doing. If they've got any damage, they've got plenty of time to get it repaired, to get out of the grid on Monday.
Is this, would you say this is a big bonus? Because obviously if they have an accident in qualifying, they will have time to repair, whereas if it on a normal weekend, they might not be able to get it completely repaired by the Sunday. Now they've got until Monday. They've got that extra day to get the car working brilliantly should anything happen on the practice and qualifying.
It certainly gives them that advantage, and it also gives them a chance to really go over the data and work out what's been happening and try to find some time from the data and come out fighting on the Monday. So yeah, it's a different structure, but I think for an opening round, I would imagine if I was a driver, just kind of getting a feel for what's going on in 2022, I would quite enjoy that day of calm and reflection before I hit the track racing on the Monday.
And we've also got that, we've got the BMW M4 taking part in the British GT as well this year, which in IMSA, I know it's slightly off topic, they did see they're seeing a bit better performances out of the M4 than they have done previously. Do you see the M4 doing anything special in the British GT, or would you say that this year will be a sort of research year, as it were?
Oh, it's going to be interesting because Century are taking the BMW, the M4 GT3. I mean, they're well versed in the M4 GT4. They won the championship with it last year, so that isn't a problem. They're taking the M4 GT3, but the first driver that's been announced for that is a lady by the name of Chen. She's a Taiwanese driver who's had quite a lot of experience racing in Asia, but has decided to come to Europe this year because there are still a lot of COVID travel restrictions in Asia, and she wants to get some more race miles under her belt. So she's been declared as driver one for the 91 car, the Century M4 GT3. I haven't heard the news yet as to who her co-driver would be. One would suppose it's going to be somebody very experienced because, she's going to have a big learning curve in a country she's never raced in, on a circuit she's never raced on, in a car that I don't believe she's raced in before either, with limited testing time. So hopefully she's going to have somebody very experienced working alongside her that weekend. I hope she does well. It's a big challenge for Ms. Chen. But she's clearly got the confidence to come to Europe and give it a go. So I think she will, probably give a good account of herself. I mean, it's interesting as well that we're seeing the new 70S or 76 racing team bringing their McLaren 720S GT3 for Mia Fluitt and Ewan Hankey. This is their first time out in a Gt3 car. They were the GT4 Pro-Am champions in 2020. Very well presented themselves. They intended to move to GT3 in 21 for obvious, pandemic related issues. That didn't happen. They're back in 22 in a beautifully liveried car. Ewan Hankey, very experienced. Mia Fluitt's had a lot of miles now in various McLaren chassis. I think they could be another one that's got probably little experience in that car, but clearly the confidence to want to give it a go. And I think they will be a very interesting one to watch as well.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, obviously, Alton Park is a completely unique circuit. It's one of those circuits that is really narrow, so is very hard to overtake. I mean, just how hard is it to overtake, Mike, around the Alton Park circuit?
It's very hard. It's very hard indeed. You generally have to rely on different characteristics of different cars to get something done, because two cars with sort of fairly equal performance and especially producing performance at the same points on the circuit, it's very hard to find a margin to get something done. Every move you make is always going to feel a bit marginal. Very few points on the circuit, whereas there's a clear move on. So I don't know exactly what how differently the cars in British GT produce their performance. Startlingly, I've not been given a drive yet. So never experienced racing in British GT. If the cars are producing performance in different ways, so for example, traction may be the strong point of one car, whereas another car perhaps has a better top end, then maybe you can pick something out. You can follow a car and work out where you're going to get that move done. But yeah, if you were following an identical piece of machinery that's producing lap time in the same way as you, any move's going to feel marginal. It's not very clear at Alton.
And that's going to be the difficulty, Anne, isn't it? Because obviously you'll have teams that have both got AMG Mercedes or teams that have both got McLarens. That's going to be their difficulty overtaking, is the fact that the cars will be so similar that an overtaking at Alton Park is so difficult. You're going to have that moment where they're just going to be sitting behind each other trying to get past.
Yeah, I guess. I think, for the opening round as well, the way the team manages itself, time taken at pit stops, how well the amateur driver handles traffic, how well they equip themselves under pressure. Mistakes are going to get made. So it's not as if you're looking at completely matched drivers in completely matched cars. They are going to be under pressure. Mistakes are going to be made, but it's a tough circuit. So it's a really good test for everybody for the opening round.
And do you think we'll see a lot of tyre conservation going in, and where they're trying to preserve the tyres so they don't have to make any extra pit stops, due to the fact that the weather's going to be quite warm, the track temperature will be quite high, and the fact that Alton Park is very wearing on the tyres?
I don't think so. I think they will stick to the structure. I mean, the tyres have been chosen to match the performance of the cars. this isn't a series where you really want to start, discussing multiple stop strategies. If you do that, you're finished. So no, I think they will push on what they've got, and I expect them to be fine. I mean, the whole purpose of British GT is to encourage the amateur driver to enter and enjoy the competition in a fairly run series with good and sensible balance of performance. So they're not going to throw a curveball in with tyres that are going to degrade that quickly. So I don't see that as an issue.
Okay, and who would you say, Andy, is the top three? If you had to pick three drivers from GT4 that would win their class, what three drivers would you do? If you were to pick them now to win the class, what three would you pick?
In GT4, I think, well, obviously, Will Burns is returning with Century Motorsport. He's the current GT4 champion. He's lost Gus Burton as his partner next this year, who's gone on to Carrera Cup, but he's joined by Jack Brown. I think they're gonna race very hard. We've seen the entrance of the Veluga Motorsport in the 718 Cayman GT4 RS, which is a very capable machine. Ross Wiley, back 2014 GT4 champion, back in GT4 machinery for the first time since then, racing alongside Benji Hetherington, not a driver that I'm very familiar with, but nevertheless, I think they're going to be pushing very hard. The Stella Motorsport, Richard Williams and Senan Fielding, again, two very strong drivers, a silver pairing, could well be pushing for overall honours. But I think the one that I'm looking at, and I think is going to really surprise us, they're a Pro-Am pairing, but the Pro-Am champions from 2021, Matt Topham and long-standing factory ace Darren Turner in the Vantage AMR GT4, the Newbridge Motorsport car. Topham is much more experienced now than he was this time last year, and I think they're going to be very competitive, and I wouldn't be surprised to see them regularly on the overall podium, and they could surprise us, and they could be looking at an overall title this year at GT4.
I mean, is it weird that we've got such a high caliber driver as Darren Turner in the GT4 Aston rather than in a GT3 Aston, where you'd probably expect him to be, because you'd think he'd be so highly sought after that to me anyway, it's a bit surprising that he's down in GT4.
Well, there is no Aston racing in GT3, so he wouldn't have that opportunity there. But I think the way that Aston and other factories look at it, if you're racing GT3 or GT4 and you want a factory professional within your team and you can afford to pay the fee, bring it on. And I think Darren Turner really enjoyed last season. I think he got on very well with Matt Topham. They had some excellent performances. I think he found in Matt Topham a student that he could really teach the ways of the Vantage AMR. They got some good results. No, I think he's very happy there. I mean, Darren Turner's raced everything with Aston Martin, from GT World Challenge, British GT at the top level, Le Mans, GTE, everything. I think he really enjoys GT4, and I think, obviously he'd like a crack at an overall title, but I don't think he's at all unhappy racing a GT4 car.
Yeah, and for the people at home, maybe the ones that just tuned in today and didn't really follow British GT, a bit like Mike really, who didn't really follow British GT last year, get as basic as you can, if possible, what are the main differences between a GT4 and a GT3 car?
Primarily power. I think the GT3 cars are something like 550 brake, whereas a GT4 is between 400 and 450. The GT4s have got a few more driver aids in them, but the GT3 cars are just basically quicker and more demanding to drive. And if you're an amateur driver, you want to be in the best machinery you can afford, and that, within the UK at this level is GT3. But I mean, let's not beat about the bush. That they are both GT3 and GT4 cars are highly specialised racing machinery. There's nothing junior about GT4. They are still very sophisticated cars.
Yeah, and as far as I can work out, there's no Alpine GT4s racing in British GT, which to me which sort of surprised me when in the GT World Challenge, because that they've been around for a few years, but to see them so many of them in the GT World Challenge, it was like, okay, so people are starting to use them, but I don't think there are any in British GT as far as I can work out.
No, I mean we've got what have we got? Aston Martins, McLarens, the Toyota GR Supra GT4, the Porsche. That's going to be really interesting. The Ford Mustang. We've seen some great performances from that over the past couple of seasons. The McLaren and a venerable Ginetta G56 GT4. I mean, they've been racing G56s in GT4 class now for many, many years. And that's an interesting car because that is the Assetto Motorsport that's got Joe Wheeler and Freddie Tomlinson driving. Now, Joe Wheeler is the son of Peter Wheeler, who owned TVR from 1981 to 2004, and Freddie Tomlinson is the son of Ginetta owner Lawrence Tomlinson. And Ginetta have dominated one-make racing at that kind of junior to intermediate level now for probably the best part of a decade. So both of those drivers have grown up with a motorsport background and are getting into a car that I would suspect they both know very, very well. I'll be really interested to see how they go. They could be a real surprise in that field.
I mean, would you expect anything out of a Ginetta, which, as you said, have been around for quite a few years and hadn't really had any success in multi-make endurance racing like the British GT?
It has in the past. I mean, it was a very successful car. One would assume that with Freddie Tomlinson in the team, and although it's not a works entry, I'm guessing that his father is probably going to keep a very close eye on what's going on. That's going to be a very well prepared, very well fettled car, and we could see some interesting results in it. I remember working with a team back in, I think it was 2016 or 2017. No, beg your pardon, it was 2018. We were running a G56 and really kind of struggled to get the performance from him. But who's to say that, in a balance of performance formula, that they can't find something in that car and really make it, really get it to work this year. So I think it's a really interesting spread of brands and manufacturers across GT4.
Yeah, it is. And for those of you at home, we had the Festival Power event on before, of course. This is another event, which is one where you just have to go. For those of you that are interested in going, it's £32 for the weekend, which gives you Friday testing, Saturday qualifying, and Monday racing for an adult. Or for £8 for the testing Good Friday, and then £18 for Saturday, and then £22 for the Monday. And then, of course, on the Monday, the grandstands have an extra sort of little fee of £12 should you want to go sit in them, but there's plenty of free areas to go and see. And it's one of those events that you just sort of love to go and see, love to take part, because, as you said, you've got massive variety. But it's the sounds that you'll hear. You've got Lamborghinis, you've got Ferraris, you've got Porsches, you've got Astons, you've got Bentleys, you've got all sorts of machinery that you wouldn't see racing on a normal weekend taking part, as well as the support racing with the GB3 and GB4 single-seaters, and, of course, the Ginettas as well. So you've got a packed sort of program of racing. And it's just one of these great ways to go and see it, isn't it, Andy?
It is. I mean, and British GT, I firmly believe, is probably the best domestic GT racing series in the world. It's always very well supported, both by teams and by the fan base. It's racing on some iconic circuits. I mean, I think we haven't really sort of discussed GT3, but the GT3 title battle this year, I think, is going to be a really intriguing one, because we haven't got the 2021 champions back for this year. We've had some changes in some of the driver combinations, but Ian Loggy racing alongside Jules Gounon for most of the rounds and Callum McLeod for some of the other rounds in the Ram Racing Mercedes. He's got a lot of race miles under his belt now. And looking at the GT3 Grid, I have to say that car is my favourite for the championship. Jules Gounon has a real hard charger. Ian Loggy gives not an inch anywhere. A very competitive, very determined man. And I think that could well be the one for the championship this year. But you've also got Richard and Sam Neary in the number 8 Team ABBA Racing Mercedes. Showed themselves to be highly competitive hard chargers in 2021. They finished 8th in the championship last year with I think it was a win and 2 additional podiums. They had a huge start line. Richard Neary had a huge start line accident at Spa, which meant they DNF'd that race, and then they weren't on the grid for the following 2 races at Snetterton. But without that, I think they would have been serious championship contenders. They've got a lot of race miles under their belt. They raced British GT and GT Cup last year. I think they're running both programs again this year. So they're going to be very competitive. You've also got Michael Igoe and Phil Keane in the WPI Lamborghini. Phil Keane, one of the best GT3 driver coaches working in the UK today, right up there with Johnny Adam. Michael Igoe, he's only been racing since 2018, but he's got absolutely no fear. He's a 10/10 driver all the way. They are going to be putting that car on pole, and they're going to be getting podiums and wins. Absolutely no doubt whatsoever. So I think this is going to be this has the makings of a really classic year for British GT. Very competitive, some fantastic racing, some very hard racing across both the categories, and certainly one. So if you can get to it, fantastic. If you can't, it's all live streamed on the GT World YouTube channel. Always worth tuning in for.
Exactly. So, Andy, thank you so much for the British GT preview.